Well, more specifically, stocks are securities that each represent a fraction of ownership of a corporation, which entitles the owner of the stock to a proportion of the corporation's assets and profits equal to what fraction of the corporation they own. A stock market, or stock exchange, is a space where investors can buy and sell shares of stock in companies that allow themselves to be publicly traded. The price of each share is driven by supply and demand, which themselves are affected by various things. Supply is altered when an investor decides to sell a large amount of shares, or when the corporation chooses to issue more available shares. And demand can be affected by things like public perception of the corporation, current events, whether your raiser thinks sexism is good or not, really anything. If Biden shat himself on the air, it would probably affect the stock market. Which is why if you, perhaps, are in a position of power to affect the companies and by extension these stocks, you should not also be able to own stocks or be related to people who own them, because that gives you an unfair advantage. So, like, if Biden bought stock in a diaper company and then himself during the State of the Union, that would be bad of him. For a few reasons, actually. So if you think of stocks as gambling, which it kind of is, well, this would be similar to regulations that bar casino employees from gambling in the places they work, except not really, because casino employees have the same odds as everyone else, right? So never mind, I guess, actually. It's actually more needed with the stock market than the gambling at casinos thing. Modern stock trading was developed in the 1600s in Amsterdam when the Dutch East India Company became the first publicly traded company. Though how they found the time to do it while busy hunting for Jack Sparrow is beyond me. He is so slippery, he is. Over here in America, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange was founded in 1790. And a few years later, we got the New York Stock Exchange. Jumping forward almost 200 years, like the time wizard I am! In 1971, trading began on another stock exchange in America, the National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotations, or NASDAQ, one of the most threatening acronyms known to man. In 1992, NASDAQ merged with the International Stock Exchange, based in London, to form the first intercontinental linkage of security markets. The NASDAQ was also special in that it was the first stock exchange to allow trading to be done on computers, instead of requiring investors to be in the same physical room to trade in person. So instead of doing that thing where you stand in a big room full of big TVs and scream gibberish, you can now quietly sit at home and look at those other screens with all the numbers and lines on them and scream gibberish if you want. I think there's also a big green arrow that shoots up or a red one that shoots down, and you have to you gotta dodge it. Yeah! Right! There's that metal bull that comes to life that you fight, like Colossus from X-Men, but a bull. Anyway, that's basically it. Stocks represent a small percentage of company ownership, which equates to a profit share. Stock value goes up and down based on external factors that include the health of the company, and investors buy and sell shares for profits or losses as the prices go up and down. And the bull fights. In theory, simple. It obviously gets a lot more complicated than that. There are different types of stock, like common stock and preferred stock, which confer to shareholders different levels of control over the company. And depending on the size of the company, the factors that affect the price of shares can be unbelievably complex, but that's it in a nutshell. And while it all sounds silly because money is fake, there's more than enough of this so-called money in the stock market to have huge, overarching effects on the national and global economies. The Roaring Twenties, the subsequent Great Depression, 1987's Black Monday starring Don Cheadle, the 2002 tech bubble, and the 2008 housing market crash are just the most well-known examples of changes in the stock market having drastic effects on the lives of average people. The appeal here is that financial markets are generally pretty volatile, especially in the last few decades. The reasons for this are too complicated and boring for me to even consider talking about here, but the point is that volatility can mean massive gains for the right investor at the right time, even as it means massive losses for all those investors at just the wrong time. Incidentally, this is why cryptocurrency is often compared more closely to a stock than to the much less volatile, far more stable, nation-backed currencies like the US dollar. This, of course, brings us to the whole insider trading dilly. With all this money theoretically up for grabs, it's no surprise that insider trading is an appealing prospect to the less ethically scrupulous stock traders. This is the practice of, to quote one legal definition, trading of a company's stocks or other securities by individuals with access to confidential or non-public information about the company, and is regulated by the SEC. Like, if you were a higher up at a big fancy corporation and you got tipped off that something big was about to go down, so then you cashed out all your shares before the public knew anything, so share value hadn't dropped yet, that would generally be considered a dick move. And that brings us to today, where a bunch of people are arguing very loudly about whether or not congresspeople, their spouses, and other government officials should be legally allowed to trade stocks while in office. Now, this may seem like a clear-cut, one-sided situation, because it is. Sitting lawmakers have the ability to pass legislation that could affect stock value, and they're susceptible to bribes from the large corporations whose stocks stand the most to gain from shady dealings. Pretty obvious doorway to corruption that has been literally open since the New York Stock Exchange became a thing that existed. In fact, the very first American inside trader was William Duer, who in 1789 was appointed the first assistant secretary of the Treasury underneath Alexander Hamilton. Thinking he could use his insider connections to Hamilton to make a killing by speculating on the newly issued debt of the infant government, Duer borrowed heavily, went bankrupt when the bubble burst, and caused the first ever US market crash. Hey, Lynn! Where's our terribly sung song about that, Lynn? Additionally, in 1872, the Union Pacific Railroad awarded its construction contract to a company of its own creation, Credit Mobilier, which then immediately proceeded to charge the federally financed railroad project grossly inflated sums. In order to protect their schemes from the long arm of the law, insiders let several members of Congress buy shares of Credit Mobilier for much less than the stock was worth. Ultimately, nobody faced criminal charges because this is America and they were wealthy. And of course, there was that time in 1929 when a man used the Time Enforcement Commission to travel in the past and play the market before getting launched out a window by a guy with a mullet. That last example was at least awesome, but unfortunately also fictional. So yeah, this isn't a revelation, but rather something that's been happening for almost as long as our country has existed. And yet, amazingly, it appears that the only real efforts to do something about this didn't happen until 10 gosh darn years ago.
One line in a bill in Congress can be worth millions and millions of dollars. I mean, there was one night we had a late night caucus, and you could kind of tell how a vote was going to go the next day. And I literally walked home and I thought, man, if you went online and made some significant trades, you could make a lot of money on this. You could just see it. You could see the potential here.
So in 2004, Baird and Congresswoman Louise Slaughter introduced the Stock Act, which would make it illegal for members of Congress to trade stocks on non-public information and require them to report their stock trades every 90 days instead of once a year.
That is former Democratic House member Brian Baird talking about this in 2011 as they pushed the Stock Act, which we'll get to in a moment. And since then, people have slowly begun to come around on what is not even close to a partisan issue. Pretty much everyone, Democrats and even the MAGA-iest of Republicans, seem to agree that the notion of legislators using their position to enrich themselves on the stock market is, at least in theory, a bad thing. Of course, the key words there are pretty much everyone. Where the disagreement lies is that some people seem to think that lawmakers just won't do insider trading out of the goodness of their hearts or something, I guess. You know how politicians are famous for being selfless, law-abiding citizens who never act in their own self-interest? Arguments opposing legislation banning this behavior tend to boil down to something along the lines of, it's a free market, we're allowed to do whatever we want, which is, all things considered, not incredibly compelling. Also, and this is important, I'm not even exaggerating about that.
Because this is a free market and people, we're a free market economy, they should be able to participate in that.
Oh yeah, you slay, Nancy. That was the Speaker of the House shrugging off questions about violations of the aforementioned Stock Act. For context, the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, signed in 2012, was the first piece of U.S. legislation that addressed insider trading on Capitol Hill. It was amazingly bipartisan, passing in the Senate with a 96-3 vote and the House with a 417-2 vote. The law makes trading on inside congressional knowledge criminal and requires public disclosure of any trades within 45 days. It also Stop trading on congressional knowledge. Stock Act, like stocks, but it's that I get it. That's good. Anyway, the Stock Act also requires those reports to be made available online in a database that members of the public